Thank you, Rodney, for having me, and everyone that was involved in making this event and this movement happen, and for joining me here today. I just want to start off by saying that I wish I didn't need to be here speaking with you today. I wish none of us needed to be here. But the truth is this: the justice system in this country is broken. Instead of listening to victims and their families and responding to their legitimate needs, they're often ignored. Instead, choosing to placate repeat violent criminals at the expense of the security and safety of our communities. Now, I'm from Victoria, British Columbia, and the latest example of this happened just last month in my home province, where an individual was found guilty of sexually assaulting his own 11-year-old stepdaughter and received 0 jail time. Not a single day in jail. Think about that for a second. And the amazing thing is that it actually gets worse, because this individual was a repeat offender. Just years earlier, he had been convicted of a similar sexual offense against his 14-year-old niece and has now been designated as a high-risk reoffender. How can you repeatedly sexually assault children in your own family who are under your protection and receive no jail time, and then just get released right back into your community? It defies common sense and disbelief. It's dangerous and it's wrong. But unfortunately, the unfortunate truth of this is that this isn't the rare exception. All too often, this is how Canada's justice system works. A revolving door for these repeat violent offenders who get light sentences, 4th and 5th and 6th chances, and early parole. Every day you see it in the newspaper, on TV. It's one story after another. Now, here's another example. A couple months ago, earlier this year, a woman reached out to me over Facebook to share with me her story. Her name was Barb Perceau. Her son, Doug, was a 42-year-old Good Samaritan in Chilliwack, BC, who had rushed to the aid of a young woman lying seriously injured on the ground, when all of a sudden, out of nowhere, completely unprovoked, he was brutally and mercilessly attacked by an unknown assailant, stabbed repeatedly, viciously, 14 times with a knife, including once in the heart, killing him. Now, this individual was arrested and later identified as 35-year-old Kirkland Joseph Russell. But despite this, despite the overwhelming and irrefutable evidence that a capital crime had been committed by a repeat violent offender, they allowed him to plead down to manslaughter. And he only got 8 years in prison, and less time served, which is a time and a half. So all this combined, he's going to be out on parole in just a couple of years. How is this possible? How can you commit such a terrible, irredeemable crime like taking a life that can never be brought back and serve a sentence in the single digits? Well, according to the judge, the rationale was that this individual was so inebriated when he committed the offense that they couldn't prove beyond a reasonable doubt the motive. That's what he said. If you repeatedly stab somebody in the chest over and over again while yelling out, and I quote, "Why won't you effing die?" you know exactly what you're doing. And the judge also pointed out that this individual had a rough childhood. A rough childhood. Now, this is an individual who had 50 prior convictions, including 8 with a knife. If you wanted to use that excuse for one of the first, second, or third of those 50 prior convictions, that'd be one thing. But at a certain point, he has to take responsibility for his actions and face the consequences for them. And the truth is this: this guy should have never been released in the first place. He should have never been walking around in the first place. And yet, in just a couple of years, he will be out walking around free again. Which raises the question, how many innocent people have to die before our politicians wake up and realize that animals like this need to be locked away for life, period. And until that happens, which is why this is so important, this kind of thing is just going to continue to happen over and over again. Brian Abrosimo, another individual, a serial rapist, raped at least 3 women, including an innocent 11-year-old girl, has been arrested, sentenced, and released repeatedly 3 times, including again in 2017. And how about Randall Hopley? He's the convicted sex offender and notorious child abductor who was assessed by Correctional Service Canada as being at a very high risk to violently and sexually reoffend, and we just released him into the streets of Vancouver. If you're found guilty of a violent sexual offense against young children and assessed to be at a high risk to reoffend, we cannot simply release them back into our cities and towns. We just can't do it. Now, we can have an open and reasonable debate about the merits of rehabilitation versus the demands of justice and deterrence. We can have that debate. That's a debate that will always happen and continue to happen. But when it comes to the safety of our society, the safety of our citizens, and the safety of, most importantly, our most vulnerable, our children, the margin for error has to be 0. It has to be 0. Now, that means, yes, tougher sentencing, closing the loopholes, but it also means taking a close, hard look, as Rodney mentioned earlier, about where we are holding these individuals and the facilities in which we are holding them. Since 2011, more than 20 child murderers have been transferred to minimum security healing lodges in Canada.
That's a shame.
These are institutions without any perimeter fencing whatsoever. They more closely resemble the hotel I stayed at last night than anything like a prison. And these inmates, while they're staying, actually you're not allowed to call them inmates when they stay there. They're residents. They're quote unquote residents when they stay there. So while these child murdering residents are staying at these healing lodges, they get their own bedroom, bathroom, kitchenette, and living area. They're encouraged to take part in these artistic stuff with paint and pastels and all these fancy things. Of course, all at the expense of taxpayers. We need to be clear. Child killers who abduct, rape, and murder children need to be locked away for life, period. Not in some quasi-spiritual wood cabin retreat, in a prison. In a prison. And I have to say that it's just one thing that you can actually, on the bright side, is the work that Rodney did, and that I'm sure many of the other people here today helped him out with, was getting at least one of those child murderers sent back from one of those healing lodges to the jail cell where she belongs. And just looking back on that, the courage that you've shown through all of this to continue to fight for justice in the memory of Tori is really incredible, and succeed, even if it was a small victory, is incredible. And it just goes to show how much resolve and courage you really do have. And I know that you share that courage and that resolve with the other victims' families here today with you, supporting you. So thank you for that. And I just want to leave you with one other thought over the sound of this behind me, which is, especially with that noise, there might be days when you think the people in that building there aren't listening, or where the people in the courts and the judges aren't listening, or when people at CSC, Correctional Service Canada, aren't listening. But I'm gonna let you in on a little secret from the work that I do. It doesn't really matter, because the people are listening. Canadians are listening. Canadians are listening. And in this country, they are the true decision makers, and they agree with you 100%. That it's time to put victims and their families first. That it's time to rebalance the scales of justice in this country. And to understand, when it comes to those guilty of the most heinous crimes in Canada, there are some individuals that do not deserve another chance. There are some individuals that we cannot afford to give yet another chance. That when it comes to their life sentences, life must truly mean life. Thank you very much for having me, Rodney. Thank you for everyone here for being here and showing your support. It's a great cause. Thank you very much.